The moment I turned the faucet and nothing came out, I thought it was a glitch. Then I checked the garden hose, the livestock trough, even the emergency spigot by the barn. Not a drop. My dog, Tucker, stood by the dry water bowl, tilting his head in confusion. That's when I walked down the dirt path to my private well and saw it, an industrial chain wrapped around the main valve, padlocked tight, and a smug HOA notice nailed into my wooden fence. Private wells prohibited. HOA compliance required. I stood there blinking, barefoot, still holding my toothbrush. It was 6:30 in the morning. And Karen, the woman who once tried to fine me for having beige curtains, had just cut me off from my own legally permitted water supply. That was the moment everything snapped. You don't steal a man's water and expect him to roll over. You declare war, and I was about to launch a siege that went 50 feet underground. It all began 3 years ago when I bought the land. I had moved to Clearwater Estates not because I loved HOA communities. I actually loathed them, but because the land was beautiful, the price was right, and more importantly, my property was technically on the outskirts, grandfathered in with its own utilities. That meant my own septic, my own electricity, and most importantly, my own deep water well, drilled legally with county approval back in the 90s. I wasn't connected to the HOA's overpriced water system. I didn't have to pay their monthly hydration surcharge. I minded my business, paid no dues, and kept to myself. And for a while it was peaceful. Then came Karen. Karen Driscoll moved into the HOA chair position like a vulture lands on roadkill, loud, self-important, and reeking of superiority. She introduced community enrichment initiatives, which basically meant spying on everyone's lawn height and demanding conformity. She'd walk around in yoga pants and a whistle, measuring flower beds like a building inspector. We'd had minor clashes before. She once tried to report me for unregistered livestock when my niece brought over her pet goat for a weekend visit. But until now, she hadn't touched anything vital. Blocking my well was the final straw. Not just because it was illegal, but because of the way she did it. The HOA notice wasn't signed by the board. It was scribbled in Sharpie and stamped with a fake HOA logo she printed off her home printer. The lock on my well was heavy-duty, the kind you use on construction site. She had gone out of her way to physically trespass on my land and sabotage my water source, all because she didn't like the fact that I wasn't under her thumb. That morning, I didn't go to work. I didn't even make coffee. I sat on my porch with a pen, a yellow notepad, and a fire burning in my chest. If Karen wanted a water war, I'd show her what happens when you mess with someone who owns the ground beneath your feet. My first call was to the sheriff's department, but predictably, they were hesitant. They said since the well was shared easement adjacent, the HOA might claim some jurisdiction, though they admitted it looked shady. The deputy told me I could try civil court but warned it could take months. Karen knew that. She counted on bureaucracy to slow me down while she strutted around playing queen of the cul-de-sac. So I pivoted. I didn't need court. I needed leverage. The second call was to a friend of mine named Wes, a water rights attorney who owed me a favor after I helped him rescue his dog during a flash flood last year. Wes wasn't just a good lawyer. He was the kind who read zoning code like bedtime stories. I told him what happened. He chuckled once and said, "Let's find out who really owns the dirt under their pumps." While Wes started digging into aquifer rights, I paid a quiet visit to the HOA clubhouse. Not to confront Karen, but to observe. I parked a block away and watched from behind the gazebo. Sure enough, Karen was giving a walking tour to a few new residents, explaining how the HOA ensured sustainable, fair distribution of water resources. The irony almost made me gag. I snapped a few pictures of her bragging near the clubhouse fountain, a 500-gallon monstrosity she insisted needed to run daily for ambience. It was still gushing water while my livestock sat thirsty. By the afternoon, I'd rigged a backup system, a makeshift rain barrel filtration contraption and a few jugs from the supply shed. Tucker drank, the goats got their fill, and I stayed hydrated. But I knew this wasn't sustainable. I needed real water. I also needed to make sure Karen couldn't just do this to someone else next. That night, Wes called back with a tone that told me something juicy was coming. "You're going to want to sit down," he said. I already was. The HOA has no filed claim to Aquifer 29B. 0. They've been drawing water under a grandfathered permit issued to the Clearwater Ranch from 1974. But here's the kicker. The ranch dissolved years ago, and the mineral rights under that land were never transferred to the HOA. They belong to whoever owns the underground deed. I felt my breath catch. "You're saying it's available?" I asked. "I'm saying," Wes said, "that if you find the current owner or inheritor and make a deal, you could control every gallon under that neighborhood, including the ones going into Karen's house." The hunt began immediately. I tracked down the last known owner of the Clearwater Ranch, an old family from 3 counties over. After a few phone calls and some generous negotiation, I had a deal pending. I didn't even have to buy the land, just the aquifer rights beneath it. A lease-to-own agreement with full transfer clause if they defaulted. They hadn't even realized the value of what they held. I had just become the legal controller of the aquifer that powered Karen's empire, and she had no idea. I waited 2 days, just long enough to savor it. Then, at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, I drove out to the maintenance access road the HOA used for their pumping station. I didn't touch anything, not yet. I simply marked the boundary line with surveyor flags and posted a formal notice of underground rights ownership on a legal placard at the fence. It read, "Controlled flow area, entry requires consent by order of the aquifer leaseholder." I took photos. I printed 3 copies. One went to the sheriff's office. One went to the county zoning board. One went into Karen's mailbox with a note that read, "You took my water. Now I hold yours." The next morning, her fountain sputtered dry. My goats were hydrated. And I was only just getting started. Karen didn't react immediately, and that surprised me. I expected a full-blown tantrum the moment she read the letter I dropped into her HOA mailbox, but the first day passed with silence. Maybe she was playing it cool, assuming I was bluffing. Maybe she hadn't even bothered to read it. But by the second morning, things started to shift. That was when I noticed the community clubhouse fountain, Karen's pride and joy, the one she demanded stay on 24/7 for aesthetic continuity, was trickling instead of flowing. A few residents passed by with puzzled looks, tapping the side of the basin like that would somehow fix it. I leaned on my fence, pretending to trim a bush, and watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. Karen may have thought she could steal my water and walk away, but she had just entered a game she didn't even understand. And I wasn't playing fair. I was playing smart. Wes and I met at a quiet diner just outside town to finalize the paperwork. The former ranch family had accepted our lease terms, signed the transfer documents, and even sent in mineral rights confirmation from their old homestead deeds. That meant, as of 10:46 a.m. that morning, I had full underground water access rights to Aquifer 29B beneath the HOA territory. The law was clear. The land on top might be the HOA's, but the subsurface rights could be separately owned and controlled. Karen had locked me out of a single valve, so I took the entire aquifer. And unlike her, I followed the law to the letter. Back home, I made a few adjustments to my own water system. I'd already buried a secondary access valve and installed a new solar pump on a timer. My livestock were now fed by a pressurized underground tank, disguised beneath an oversized decorative rock I bought from a landscaping auction. It looked like lawn art, but underneath it was one of the most advanced water control setups in the county. Meanwhile, I spent the afternoon walking the property line with surveyor flags and rechecking my zoning boundaries. No one could accuse me of trespassing. If Karen was going to retaliate, I needed every move of mine to be clean and precise. I wasn't going to give her a single crack to squeeze through. The HOA maintenance team showed up the next morning, scratching their heads at the clubhouse pump station. I heard snippets of their confused muttering as I passed by on the way to the feed store. One guy, clipboard in hand, said, "Tank didn't fill last night. Backup pump's dry too." Another added, "Karen said it was probably vandalism." I smiled as I loaded a bag of chicken feed into my truck. Let her blame the wind. She was so used to controlling the surface, she didn't realize the real game was happening underneath her perfectly pruned hedges. That afternoon, Karen marched right up to my driveway, sunglasses perched on her head like a misplaced crown, lips pursed into a scowl sharp enough to cut concrete. She didn't knock. She stood with her hands on her hips and shouted my name like she was summoning a disobedient dog. I stepped outside with an apple in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Do you think this is funny?" she snapped. "I think it's educational," I replied, taking a long drink. "You might learn a thing or two about legal ownership." Her face twisted. "You can't block access to public water. That's a criminal offense." "Actually," I said, holding up the signed copy of the Aquifer lease in a protective sleeve, "this isn't public water. It's privately sourced, privately owned, and legally documented. I even had it notarized by your cousin Gina. Lovely woman, by the way." Karen tried to snatch the paper, but I pulled it back. She was fuming, sputtering half-formed legal threats, but she had nothing concrete. She finally said, "You'll regret this. I'll have the county out here by noon." "Great," I said. "Make sure they bring the updated mineral rights registry. I'd love to show them around." And just like that, she stormed off, stomping through the gravel with more drama than a parade of toddlers. I didn't gloat. Not yet. I knew she wasn't done. But I also knew she'd never expected a quiet neighbor with goats and a wind chime collection to suddenly own the HOA's lifeline. That was the thing about Karen, she thought power lived in rules and fines. But real power was quiet, invisible, and signed in ink. Later that evening, I got a call from Ted, my longtime neighbor and part-time mole on the HOA board. Ted had always hated Karen but kept his seat to keep the rest of us from drowning in paperwork. He chuckled when he picked up. "She just called an emergency board meeting," he said. "Tried to label you a hostile utility threat." "Did it work?" I asked. "Not exactly. Turns out some of the members have been noticing their own sprinklers sputtering. One guy's koi pond dried out. Another's water pressure dropped to a trickle. You've got folks more mad at her than you." Ted let me know that Karen had ordered a full inspection of the HOA system. What she didn't know was that the inspection would only reveal everything working from their end. But the water itself? That was under my control now. I wasn't cutting them off entirely, not yet. I was adjusting the pressure ever so slightly. Random outages. Delays in refill times. Just enough to sow confusion and desperation. And soon, the community would be demanding answers. The following morning brought the first wave of community complaint. I overheard two elderly neighbors shouting at a maintenance worker about their washing machine not filling. Another woman yelled something about her dog's bath being interrupted mid-lather. Karen doubled down with another flyer, this one warning about sabotage and criminal behavior from rogue residents. The irony was almost poetic. I printed a few copies of my Aquifer lease and stapled them to the public board just outside the HOA clubhouse. I included a short note, "When someone takes your water, fight smart." Signed, the guy with the deed. I watched from my truck as residents walked up, read it, and started murmuring. Karen showed up 10 minutes later and tore the papers down with trembling hands. But the damage was done. They were beginning to see the truth. The HOA's golden image was beginning to crack. People started asking questions Karen couldn't answer. Why was the clubhouse water failing? Why hadn't she secured the aquifer rights? Why had she cut off a privately permitted well while failing to maintain their own system? And why was she so obsessed with punishing someone who hadn't broken any rules? I didn't need to raise my voice or bang on doors. I had done the one thing Karen couldn't counter. I used the system better than she did. She underestimated me because I wore flannel and raised chickens. But she forgot that quiet doesn't mean weak, and private doesn't mean powerless. As the sun set over the half-lit fountain and Karen sat in the clubhouse porch pretending everything was fine, I watered my lawn. Slowly, deliberately, with a cold glass of fresh Aquifer water in hand. Tucker sat beside me, tongue lolling, tail wagging. In that moment, I wasn't just a guy with a well. I was the man who controlled the river running beneath their feet. And I had no intention of letting go. The pressure inside the HOA boardroom must have been boiling, because just days after I posted the Aquifer lease copies outside the clubhouse, the entire community began to shift. Residents who once greeted me with tight smiles and avoided eye contact were now waving, nodding, and even stopping by my gate to ask questions. It started small. One neighbor, Mr. Langley from 2 doors down, leaned over my fence with a plastic cup in hand and muttered, "Any chance you're selling access to that well of yours?" Another left a pie with a note that said, "Heard about what you did. Respect." But the clearest signal came when a mother of 3, completely drenched and holding a broken garden hose, shouted across the street, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Karen just banned kiddie pools to conserve water." That moment confirmed what I already knew. Karen was losing the neighborhood fast, and panic was setting in. Inside her little empire, things were unraveling. The clubhouse had reduced hours, the fountain was turned off entirely, and lawn inspections were quietly suspended. Ted, my inside guy on the board, told me Karen had entered full damage control mode. She was calling emergency meetings every evening, pushing for repairs, inspections, even floating a water delivery plan that would have increased HOA dues by 30%. Residents pushed back, loudly. And during one of those meetings, when she tried blaming me yet again, someone finally snapped. Ted said it was Martha from Lot 16, a retired school principal, who stood up and shouted, "He didn't take our water. You just failed to protect it." The room apparently fell into stunned silence. And from that moment on, Karen's hold on the community began to collapse. I wasn't finished, though. Not even close. I wanted Karen to feel the frustration she had caused others. That meant turning up the heat, just enough to make her squirm but not enough to push her into full-blown litigation. Yet. So I began Phase 2. I reduced the aquifer flow pressure feeding the HOA's primary pumps by just 12%. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to cause significant supply delays. Water took longer to reach overhead tanks, automatic timers failed, and the so-called smart irrigation system Karen had bragged about during HOA meetings sputtered into chaos. Grass began dying. Flower beds wilted. The community's once perfect appearance was turning brown and brittle. And still, my lawn looked like a postcard from Eden. I also had Tucker to thank. My dog, with his innocent face and lolling tongue, had become an accidental local celebrity. Every morning, I'd sit on the porch with him as he happily slurped fresh water from a clean bowl. Kids walking past with their parents would stop and watch, and soon, the parents would start asking about my water system. I told them the truth. My well was legal, my rights were secure, and Karen had overstepped. Some were skeptical at first, but after the HOA sent out another flyer falsely claiming I was pirating municipal resources, even the doubters began to see the cracks in her lies. One man even knocked on my door and said, "I've got a lawyer friend. Want help suing them for tampering with your property?" I declined for now. I wasn't ready to bring lawyers in unless Karen escalated. Instead, I leaned into strategy. I built a small website detailing the history of Aquifer 29B, posted public domain maps, and highlighted my legal claim with citations. It wasn't flashy, but it was factual. I emailed the link anonymously to every HOA member and labeled it, "Essential Reading for Homeowners Who Value Transparency." Ted said within 2 hours of the email going out, Karen had 6 people knocking on her office door demanding a full financial audit of water management decisions. And then came the pool incident. Karen's private pool, a pretentious kidney-shaped thing surrounded by ornamental hedges, was her pride. She often invited select neighbors for exclusive parties, boasting that it was technically off the HOA's books. But what she hadn't told anyone was that her pool was connected to a bypass line, a hidden valve that pulled extra gallons from the shared HOA water tanks every night while the pumps refilled. Ted had seen it once and mentioned it in passing. I had assumed it was a rumor, until the HOA treasurer found discrepancies in usage records and confronted Karen. She denied everything, of course, until one of the maintenance workers caught the valve open at 2 a.m., draining water directly into her pool's refill line. It was over. Karen was caught stealing from the very water source she claimed to protect. The board demanded answers. Karen deflected. She claimed it was a maintenance error, then blamed malicious sabotage, then implied I had somehow hacked the system to make it look like she was stealing. But there was video. The maintenance worker had recorded everything. And when the footage was shared in the community group chat, it spread like wildfire. Residents were furious. They demanded an immediate vote to suspend Karen's authority, pending investigation. For the first time since she took power, she looked visibly shaken. Her posture changed. Her voice cracked during the next meeting. And best of all, the community had finally turned against her. I kept quiet during all this. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't post online. I didn't give her a target. But every time another resident approached me to say, "Thank you," or "She's finally getting what she deserves," I nodded and replied with a simple truth. I just want fair access to my own well. That's all I ever wanted. But Karen wasn't done yet. She still had one last move. That week, she tried hiring a third-party contractor to drill a new well for the HOA, without permits, without zoning approval, and without informing the county. The crew showed up early, unloaded machinery, and began prepping a drill site behind the clubhouse. It was illegal, reckless, and beyond desperate. But she thought she was being clever. She thought if she could create a new well, she could bypass my aquifer access and claim victory. What she didn't count on was the fact that I had already flagged the area with the county as protected for aquifer maintenance. By noon that day, 2 county inspectors and a sheriff's deputy arrived on site. The drilling was halted. The crew was fined. The equipment was impounded. Karen showed up screaming in leopard print and sunglasses, waving her HOA badge like it meant something. The sheriff calmly explained that she had violated multiple local ordinances and that further infractions could lead to personal liability. Karen's voice cracked. She stammered, then tried to blame the contractor. But it was too late. The permit violations were documented. The photos were taken. And as she stood there, red-faced and defeated, a dozen HOA residents gathered at the clubhouse door watching it all unfold. Karen retreated into silence after that. The flyers stopped. The board meetings went quiet. And the clubhouse fountains stayed dry. Word spread that she'd locked herself in her house for 2 days and refused to answer the door. I didn't celebrate, not because I wasn't tempted, but because I knew there was still more to do. Karen's downfall was satisfying, but I wasn't interested in revenge for its own sake. I wanted lasting change. A permanent shift that would prevent another Karen from rising again. For a few quiet days, the neighborhood exhaled. Lawns perked back up, the community center resumed normal hours, and the clubhouse fountain trickled again, albeit modestly. Most residents returned to their routines, chatting about garden pests or summer events, relieved that Karen's reign of chaos had finally ended. But I wasn't naive enough to believe she had given up. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type who simmered in silence, plotting a comeback while pretending to water plants. That's why I wasn't surprised when the next act in her unraveling began not with another HOA memo or sidewalk tantrum, but with a suspicious phone call and a sudden visit from the county's Environmental Enforcement Division. I was outside stacking feed bags when a white truck pulled up, county seal emblazoned on the door. A clean-cut man with a badge stepped out, followed by a clipboard-wielding woman who introduced herself as a senior field inspector. They explained that an anonymous report had been filed against my property, citing illegal chemical dumping, unregulated well drilling, and potential contamination of groundwater sources. I blinked. That was a full bingo card of nonsense if I'd ever heard one. I kept my face calm and polite, offered them water, and led them to the well site. They found nothing. My system was clean, certified, and documented down to the last nut and bolt. I had backup permits printed, water samples tested, and the most current inspection logs filed with both the county and state. The inspectors looked mildly irritated as they wrapped up their visit, probably realizing they had just wasted half their afternoon. I offered them a copy of my Aquifer lease agreement just for fun. As they drove off, I caught the tail end of their conversation through an open window. One of them muttered, "Sounds like a vendetta, probably HOA nonsense." I didn't say a word. I just smiled and waved. Karen's next move was sloppier. She tried filing a civil complaint directly with the county water board, alleging that my well modifications had interfered with her home's plumbing. It was laughable on its face. My system was self-contained and miles away from her connection point. The board dismissed it outright within 48 hours. Still, it told me exactly what I needed to know. Karen had lost her influence in the neighborhood, and now she was swinging wildly, trying to use outside channels to punish me. But every time she tried to strike, she only exposed how powerless she had become. But then she went too far. One morning, Ted knocked on my door with a pale face and a trembling hand clutching his phone. He held it out without saying a word and pressed play on a voicemail message he had received that morning. It was Karen. Her voice was tense, frantic, and full of venom. She accused Ted of conspiring against her, of leaking internal HOA documents, and of collaborating with me to sabotage her authority. She then threatened to report him for embezzlement, something so absurd it barely made sense. But the part that chilled me came near the end. Her voice dropped to a hiss as she said, "If I go down, I'll burn every one of you with me. Nobody gets to walk away clean." That was it. The board had tolerated her tantrums, her misuse of funds, her pool siphoning, and her endless policy chaos. But threatening Ted, the one level-headed person left who still showed up to meetings with spreadsheets and actual concern for the community, was a fatal misstep. Ted sent the voicemail to every other board member. Within hours, a formal vote was scheduled to permanently remove Karen from the HOA and bar her from participating in any official activities. But Karen wasn't going to leave quietly. She showed up to the meeting in person, her hair wild, her eyes red, and her phone already recording. She marched into the room like it was a courtroom, shouted that the vote was illegitimate, and threatened to sue every person present. The residents, already tired of her theatrics, didn't flinch. Martha, calm as ever, handed her a copy of the HOA charter and highlighted the clause about conduct unbecoming of an officer. Karen tried to rip the document in half, but her shaking hands barely made a crease. The vote passed 9-0. Karen was officially out. As she stormed out of the room, someone clapped. Then another. Within seconds, the room was filled with applause, not mocking or cruel, just relieved and final. It was over. She was gone. Or so we thought. The following day, a landscaping crew arrived at the edge of my property. I hadn't hired anyone. They started digging near the outer fence line, muttering about a private drainage contract, ordered by the HOA. I immediately stepped outside and asked for paperwork. They had none. I called the county zoning office while keeping them in sight. When the officer arrived, it didn't take long to uncover the truth. Karen, just days before her final ousting, had signed a forged contract requesting a trench be dug between her home and the nearest water line, which, incidentally, crossed part of my land. The signature had her name, but the form was outdated and the contact number listed traced back to a disconnected burner phone. It was her last desperate trick, an attempt to sneak in one last utility tap before being booted for good. The crew was ordered to stop. I filed a trespassing complaint. But the best part came when the officer asked me if I wanted to press charges for forgery. I paused, genuinely considering it. But instead, I said, not yet. Let her feel it. Let her realize no one believes her anymore. That weekend, the HOA hosted a cleanup day. Volunteers came out to repaint curbs, trim hedges, and restore the community Karen had spent years poisoning with her ego. I brought out extra tools, loaned my truck, and helped a few teenagers dig a compost bed behind the park. It felt like a neighborhood again. Real conversations, laughter, kids playing without parents yelling about water rules or surveillance fines. And for the first time in a long time, there was no Karen circling on a golf cart scribbling down violations. By Sunday afternoon, someone had posted a picture of the community fountain back in action, with a handwritten sign in front that read, "Let it flow." I didn't write it, but I knew exactly who did. Ted winked at me from across the street. We didn't need words. The point had been made. That evening, just as I sat on the porch to enjoy the sunset, a sheriff's vehicle slowed down near Karen's house. I squinted, watching as an officer walked up the path with a yellow envelope in hand. Karen opened the door in a stained bathrobe, her hair tied back like she hadn't slept in days. She took the envelope, read the contents, then looked up and saw me across the street. Our eyes met for a long moment. She said nothing. I nodded once, not smug, not cruel, just letting her know the war was truly over. She shut the door without another word. The next morning, her house was listed for sale. No fanfare. No explanation. Just a quiet departure, like a defeated queen abandoning a broken castle. The HOA met again the following week to discuss long-term policy reform. I attended as a guest. Not to gloat, but to offer a suggestion, that the bylaws be updated to protect residents from overreach, especially regarding personal utilities. The board agreed unanimously. And when someone asked if I'd consider running for a board seat, I smiled and said, I think I'll stick to my goats and groundwater. But I did leave them with one more thing. A proposal to rename the Central Community Walkway from Clearwater Path to Wellspring Lane. A quiet reminder of what happens when one woman tries to take away what doesn't belong to her, and how the power beneath our feet can change everything when used the right way. The week after Karen's house was listed, there was a stillness over the neighborhood that felt earned. Like the place was finally breathing again. Gone were the aggressive memos taped to doors. Gone were the late-night calls reporting rogue sprinklers or banned flower species. It was almost eerie how quiet things became, but also refreshing. People began living like neighbors again, not inmates in a rule-bound asylum. And though I didn't strut or boast, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't satisfying to walk past the HOA office and see a new, unassuming temporary chairperson greeting people with a smile instead of a glare. Karen's name had been scrubbed from every directory. Her legacy had evaporated like the last drops of water from her drained pool. But the most satisfying part of all wasn't the silence she left behind. It was the sound of flowing water, clean, legal, and fully under my control. What I didn't expect was how quickly the community would come to me. Within days of Karen's exit, residents began approaching with quiet inquiries, mostly casual, about water. One woman asked if I offered consultations. A man wanted to know where I got my solar pump. Another asked if I'd ever consider helping the community manage its water directly, since my system was the only one that hadn't failed during the drought scare. I wasn't planning to become the neighborhood water czar, but I could see a new kind of opportunity forming, not one of control, but stewardship, fairness, balance, exactly what Karen had abused. So I proposed a deal. At the next open board meeting, I presented a cooperative agreement. The aquifer was under my ownership, yes, but I'd allow regulated access to HOA lines at a greatly reduced rate, just enough to cover maintenance and improvements. No profit-seeking. No monopolizing. In exchange, the board would draft and ratify a new clause in the bylaws that strictly prohibited interference with privately owned utilities, including wells, solar setups, and off-grid systems. It would be the first major reform in years. Surprisingly, or maybe not, the proposal passed unanimously. The result was immediate. The HOA's monthly water costs dropped by nearly 40%, and with that savings, they installed drought-resistant landscaping, repaired the failing clubhouse filtration system, and even added a small community vegetable garden. Ted oversaw the project and made sure it remained transparent. For the first time, residents received breakdowns of where their fees went, and it shocked many to see how bloated Karen's budget had been. Thousands had gone into ornamental shrubbery she personally approved. More had been funneled into maintenance on her private golf cart. The transparency opened eyes, and more than a few apologies found their way to my mailbox. Still, Karen wasn't quite finished. Even in exile, she made one last pitiful attempt to drag me down. About a week after her departure, a report was filed with the State Water Commission alleging that I had rerouted aquifer water without a permit and was engaging in unauthorized distribution. The report was clearly forged, full of errors, and cited non-existent statute. But because it came from an anonymous tip, the state was required to follow protocol. So one morning, a state inspector named James showed up in a dusty sedan with a briefcase, clipboard, and a tired expression that told me he'd been on the road too long. James didn't stay long. After a full walkthrough of my system, complete with measurements, flow reports, and water testing data, he smiled and shook my hand. He said mine was the most efficient, transparent setup he'd seen in a year. He even asked to take photos as examples for other rural communities. Before leaving, he said, "Between us, we've had 5 of these bogus reports in this neighborhood. Somebody's still bitter." I nodded. We both knew exactly who. And just like that, Karen's last whisper faded into nothing. With the threat gone, the neighborhood transformed completely. Where there had been tension, there was now openness. Ted's wife hosted a barbecue and invited everyone on the block. People brought dishes from their cultures, shared recipes, traded seed. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just the guy with the well. I was part of something again. Even the kids seemed happier. One group started calling the new vegetable garden Victory Patch, and someone painted a sign to hang above it with that very name. Around that time, I received a call from a local newspaper. They had heard whispers of the HOA conflict and wanted to interview me for a piece on grassroots utility management and citizen-led reform. I declined at first. I didn't want to stir up the past. But Ted nudged me into it, reminding me that stories like this help others stand up when their rights are threatened. So I agreed, on one condition, that the article focus on the solution, not the drama. The journalist agreed. The article was published a week later, titled "The Well That Broke the Chain: How One Man Quietly Restored Balance to His Community." It went modestly viral, and for a while, I got letters from other HOAs across the country asking for advice. One day, as I returned from the hardware store, I noticed Karen's house. It had sold. Fast. A new family was moving in. Young couple, 2 toddlers, and a dog that barked at everything. The dad waved as I walked past. I waved back. No mention of who used to live there. No warnings. No stories. Karen's shadow was gone, and the house was just a house again. What I hadn't told anyone was that I'd purchased a small plot of land at the edge of the aquifer's reach, outside the HOA entirely, as a backup site for a second well. Not because I needed it, but because I never wanted anyone to hold leverage over me again. I installed the new pump quietly, disguised the housing in a repurposed barn, and added a discreet monitoring system that would alert me to any interference. If the past few months had taught me anything, it was that preparation was peace of mind. And now I had both. Tucker, my ever-faithful companion, seemed to sense it too. He no longer barked at late-night footsteps or jumped at door knock. He lounged lazily in the yard, tail swaying, belly exposed to the sun. It was like he knew the fight was over. And it was. I spent the next few weeks just living, planting, fixing the fence. watching the stars. And when the board asked me to attend the next meeting, I went, not to fight but to listen. Ideas were floated about creating a new community name. Some suggested Clearwater Heights. Others liked Wellspring Commons. I didn't vote. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what we had become without the chains Karen had wrapped around the place. As I left the meeting that night, I walked past the community fountain, which now had a small engraved stone beside it. Someone had placed it there without ceremony. It read, "In honor of balance, truth, and the water beneath us." No name. No plaque. Just that. I stood there for a while, not because I needed to, but because I finally could. The sound of the water flowing beneath the stone was steady, calm, and complete. Just like the neighborhood. Just like me.